living on the moon. Now, planting on the moon? In 2015, NASA will try to grow basil, sunflowers, turnips, and more in aluminum cylinders on the lunar surface. Various sensors will monitor the plant's growth and send data to us Earthlings, offending every locavore everywhere.
I'm Aki Roberge, an astronomer at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. I've been studying a young nearby planetary system around the bright star Beta Pictoris. Located 63 light-years away and only about 20 million years old, the star is surrounded by a vast disk of gas, dust, and comet-like bodies that we view edgewise. We know of one planet in there too. It's a giant planet tracking along an orbit nearly as large as Saturn's. I'm part of a team studying Beta Pic's disk using the ALMA Observatory in Chile. We've found something odd. A belt of carbon monoxide gas centered about 3 times farther from the star than Neptune's distance from the Sun. The total amount of gas is about 1/6 the mass of all the water in Earth's oceans. What's interesting is that incoming ultraviolet light should break up the carbon monoxide molecules in little more than a century on average. This means that the carbon monoxide must be resupplied by the breakup of icy comets. To produce the amount of gas we detect, we're looking at the equivalent of the total destruction of a large comet every 5 minutes. From our data, we can tell that much of the carbon monoxide is in 1 or 2 massive clumps, which was very surprising. Because we're viewing the disk edge-on, we can't be sure if it's 1 or 2. Regardless, the comet supplying the gas must also be concentrated into clumps. How could this happen? If there is 1 clump, we think we're seeing the aftermath of a collision between 2 icy planets about the mass of Mars. Such a collision would have occurred about 500,000 years ago, releasing large quantities of gas and small comet-like fragments. The second, and we think more likely scenario, is that the carbon monoxide exists in 2 clumps and is continually replenished by collisions in huge comet swarms. We believe the comets are shepherded together by an as-yet undetected second planet, whose gravity confines the comets into a small region so they frequently collide. A planet with roughly Saturn's mass could do the job. Other observations hint that the brightest clump is moving in a way that makes the 2-clump scenario more likely. Further observations will track it in better detail and help us confirm this dramatic picture.
It's a great honor tonight to introduce Zecharia Sitchin again this hour, an eminent Orientalist, biblical scholar. Zecharia Sitchin, distinguished by his ability to read ancient Sumerian clay tablets and other ancient texts. Through such texts, religious documents, and archaeological findings, he has reconstructed epic events that support the existence of extraterrestrial gods who once set nation against nation and man against man. Zecharia Sitchin is a graduate of the University of London, worked as a journalist and editor in Israel for many years, living now and writing in New York, and he is our proud guest tonight on Coast to Coast. Zecharia, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine, George.
Good to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Tell me how this all started for you, Zecharia, how you started researching the Sumerian tablets.
Well, it's a long story, and I've told it already many times, and it all goes back to when I was a schoolboy, fortunate to study the Bible, the Old Testament in its original Hebrew language, and I asked improper questions of the teacher and got reprimanded, and that's how it started.
As you began to unravel the mysteries of the tablets, and you are a scholar and an expert, and I think that helped you a lot when you were able to decipher.
Well, it just took a lifetime, that's all.
It is. It has been your lifetime. You've devoted, gosh, your whole life to this.
Yeah.
And yet, I've got to tell you, Zecharia, no matter where I go, what conference I go to, phone calls to this program, people are always asking about your work and what you've done. Always.
Well, the books, that number 13 by now, have been translated to some 24 or 25 languages. They are now being translated in China, by the way. And also the Vietnamese decided that they cannot survive without reading my books in their language. So it is a worldwide phenomenon, if I can use the word,
You sure
with
can.
some pride, yeah.
You're entitled to that. Where do you get all your energy, Zechariah?
I don't know. I think I really think sometimes that maybe that's what I'm meant to do, and I always wonder whether I should write the one more book, because maybe my mission would come to an end.
Well, you're a young what? How old are you now?
That's not a nice question. I'm no longer running in the marathon. Let's put it that
but
way.
you're still going strong, and that's the important thing.
Yeah.
This latest work, the Earth Chronicles Handbook, I enjoyed it because it puts together all of the work you did in the 7 books of the Earth Chronicles.
Right.
It kind of makes all of it even easier to understand. I mean, you reading all the books, very enjoyable, very educational, but you capsulized everything in one book, and it was very helpful. It's almost like a guide, I think.
Well, like I say, it's a GPS to my books.
Absolutely. It is. In all the times that you've done your work, Zechariah, have you uncovered events later on in your research that you looked at and said, oh, I didn't see this in the beginning, but I see this now? Was there anything that ever changed?
Not basically, but I must tell you that is the question that I sometimes wonder myself, because yes, as I reread some of my early books, The 12th Planet, the Stairway to Heaven, etc., and in view of the later research and writings, and in view, most importantly, of our own scientific advances, I say, oh, my God, that's really that, which maybe I've missed before. I sometimes say, when I'm asked, how come that others who have discovered the tablets and deciphered them, etc., and started to translate them, how come they didn't realize that this text or this tale really tells this and that? And I say, well, we are all captives of our time and our technology. So if, for example, there is, and let's not forget the many illustrations, there are about 120 in each book. So if there is an illustration from antiquity that shows so-called eagle men, ancient astronauts, saluting a rocket. Now, if that same depiction would have been shown to me 100 years ago, I would have said, well, this is, I don't know, some 2 bird-like people saluting a very large pencil. And if somebody would say, no, it's not a pencil, it's a rocket, I would say, rocket, what's a rocket? So obviously, as we advance and as science keeps confirming and confirming, for example, when I started writing, and I said, according to the Sumerians, Mars served as a way station, that was really held to be almost ridiculous, because Mars was deemed a totally uninhabitable planet with no air and no atmosphere and no water and no nothing. So here I come and say they said that Mars was a way station, a space base. And now we know that there was water on Mars, and maybe there still is now water on Mars. There were seas and lakes, etc., etc. Now I said that they came here because they needed gold with which to protect their dwindling atmosphere. And now I read that a statement a couple of weeks ago by the chief scientific advisor of President Obama, who at the conference dealing with global warming, which is really climate change, said, well, all options are on the table, including geoengineering. Now, what is geoengineering? He was asked, he said, well, even such a fantastic idea as creating a shield above our atmosphere to shield us from the sun. And that's exactly what I said the so-called Anunnaki who had come here had done on their planet so long ago. So, yes, as I read and reread, I find new points, and of course, the most important thing I find corroboration of things that when I first published, or when the first book was published, it took me 30 years to research it. That seemed so outlandish.
And what is so remarkable now, too, Zechariah, astronomers are beginning to discover distant planets now in other systems. And, one day they will find that extra planet in this solar system, I am sure.
Well, they found it in 1983. The so-called IRAS,
Right. But do you think that is Nibiru?
Of course. Well, I had one of my friends was the important astronomer Harrington at the U.S. Naval Observatory, and I met him, and he gave me an interview on tape, videotape, and he pointed to a bookshelf behind his desk, and there was my book, the one you mentioned, The 12th Planet. And he said, whenever I reach a tough question, a tough point, I pick up your book, he said, for inspiration and guidance. So, no, the planet was seen, and it was immediately the next day, quashed and hush-hushed, and then, as I write in my book, Genesis Revisited, it led to the whole change in relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. And if you recall, I'm sure, George, that Reagan went to the United Nations, and speaking about his meetings with Gorbachev, said, I told him, and Reagan points with his finger up, he said, what if we all realized that we are in danger from somewhere else? Wouldn't we forget our small quabbles and unite, etc.?
So true. Zechariah, you stay with us. We're going to come right back and chat with you a little bit more about this incredible new work, the Earth Chronicles Handbook, and also find out if they're ever going to come back. Zechariah's website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com right now, but let me spell it for you. It is SITCHIN.com. I'm George Norrie. You're listening to Coast to Coast AM, and we'll be right back in just a moment with our special guest this hour, Zechariah Sitchin, author of The Earth Chronicles and the Earth Chronicles Handbook.
Get daily show updates right to your inbox for free with the new Coast Zone newsletter. Sign up today at coasttocoastam.com.
And welcome back to Coast for the rest of this hour. A chat with Zechariah Sitchin, author of numerous books. This one, the Earth Chronicles Handbook. Zechariah, two things really fascinate me. Your work on the Anunnaki and, of course, biblical prophecy, both of which you've studied quite a bit, probably more than most. Do they tie in together, the Anunnaki? I mean, will they return?
Yes.
Do we see that happening during, like, the time of the apocalypse?
Well, we are starting to use words that different people attach different meanings to them. So let me answer your loaded question, George, by saying that, first of all, I firmly believe in the veracity of the Bible as a whole and in the veracity of its prophecies. And that's where I start from. Secondly, I have no doubt that my understanding, and by now hopefully it's not just mine, that all the ancient records, some of which are the basis for my various books, are not mythology, and that they are really records of things that really happened in the past. Just as a side remark, when I'm asked what do I think my most important contribution has been to understanding where we came from and where we are going, in my first book, The 12th Planet, people expect me to say that there's one more planet, etc., etc., and I say, I think that my most important contribution is the ability to show, if not fully convince everybody, that the ancient myths are not mythology. I demythologize mythology. And I think this is the second important point to remember. So there's no doubt in my mind, and I say that after a lifetime of research, and my most important critic is I myself, asking myself, am I sure? Is it convincing, etc., etc.? And that is that others from another planet in our own solar system, that's a key difference. I'm not talking about what people would grant you. Well, you know, this whole thing, the nonsense about extraterrestrial, etc. Mm-hmm. We, of course, as thinking and intelligent people, we do not rule out that there's some life somewhere else, but this is light years away, and they'll never visit us, and we'll never visit them. I say, no, there's another planet with advanced people on it in our own solar system. So travel is possible, communication is possible. So I'm sure that they were here, and they did what partly the Bible and partly all the other sources say. And when it comes to this question that you pose, is this, will they return? Now, I used to avoid answering the question by saying, you're asking, will they return, but are you sure they left? And of course, then the questioner would be stymied, and I will not answer the question. But I did write, as I'm sure you know, and we can mention it, another book titled The End of Days, which was the concluding book of the series, the Earth Chronicle series. And I provide evidence, including some data from NASA, that around 550 BC, they did leave. But they promised to return. There's no doubt about it. They promised to return. Whether, even if you go to the so-called Mayan or Aztec, Quetzalcoatl, before he left, he said, I will return. And he said, I will return. And he gave them a date. He said, when the bundle will come together, and the king Montezuma thought that when Cortez showed up, he thought, well, that's the date.
That was it, yeah.
And the God has returned, and he paid dearly for the mistake. But there was certainty that they were promised, on the other side of the world, in the Americas. And I show, by the way, in my books, I have the book The Lost Realms, show that the whole thing is one ball of wax. All the gods were the same gods, though called by different names. So they will return, and the biblical prophecies will come true.
And it could come sooner than later, I would assume, Zechariah.
Well, their time scale is not our time scale. In my book, When Time Began, I give three like calendars. I say there's the earthly calendar that you and I use, and say today is Monday, etc. And then there's the divine calendar, which is their orbital period. And then I said to combine the two to create some kinds of sense of proportion, they devised what I call the celestial calendar, which is really what we call the zodiac, the 12 zodiacal houses, or stations as they were called in antiquity by the Sumerians. So this is their clock, and we are in the age, still in the age of Pisces. And as far, George, as I can understand the prophecies, there was a very wise and important fellow called Daniel, and he was privileged because the angels were speaking to him.
That's right.
And he could question them, and he kept asking them, when will they return? And he got all kinds of answers, including the famous times and a half, and Sir Isaac Newton, by the way, I mentioned him, and I was privileged to see his handwritten document where he made the calculations, and he also arrived at the variety of dates, but his preferred date was 2060 AD, which is still this century. So I think, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, that we are talking about this century.
If you were a university professor, I would be mesmerized in your class, Zechariah, and the bell would ring, and I think I'd still be sitting there listening.
George, if I were a university professor, I would be unable to write my books.
That's true.
Because all those very distinguished professors, whom I respect greatly, who are experts in their fields, and for example, in archaeology, one of them can pick up some shard from some broken up clay vessel, and he'll tell you that this is from the early Bronze Age, something that I cannot do. But they're specialized, and in order to keep their positions and be able to publish, etc., they have to follow the line. And many of them, when at scientific meetings and others which I used to attend, they come and whisper to me, of course you're right, but I cannot say so. So I think I and my readers are, and your listeners are blessed that I did not become an academic professor, because then I would be bound by political correctness, etc., and would hesitate to speak out.
Yeah, somebody would have tried to have muffled you, and I'm glad that...
I would muffle myself,
yeah.
Because, people make a living and have to protect their tenure, etc., and so I respect them, I understand them, but I have the freedom of calling it as I see it.
Zechariah, there is a date that keeps coming up now based on the Mayan calendar, and I am wondering if that ever came up in any of your research at all, and that, of course, is that December 21st, 2012 date.
Yes, of course. I deal with that head-on in this book that I mentioned, The End of Days. I actually dealt with it 15 years ago.
Way before most people were even talking about it.
15 years ago in the book The Lost Realms, I showed that even if some give credence to the so-called Mayan prophecies, then one can give more credence or less credence, etc. I mean, they don't stand on the same footing as the biblical prophecies, of course. So even if you do that, there is a simple matter of how you calculate, how you divide the number of days that have passed from day one till the so-called day where the 13th Baktun ends. And if you divide by 365 and a quarter, you arrive at 2012. But if you look at how the so-called Mayan calendar is constructed, which is actually the Olmec calendar, you see that it is based on 360. It is a mathematical calendar, and if you divide the number of days by 360, you arrive not at 2012, but I don't remember precisely now. It's either 2057 or 2087. I don't remember.
But it's in that gap somewhere.
Yes. So the 2012 is, in my opinion, not on firm footing. And I have, by the way, a DVD that's titled 2012, dealing with the issue. And if people click on my website, they'll see how to get it. So that doesn't mean that I don't give credence to the Mayan tales. I mentioned, the promise of Quetzalcoatl to return.
Yes.
I even showed that, which nobody else does, because they didn't go to Mexico as many times as I did, and go to museums where nobody else goes and found those things. There's actually a sculpture, a Mayan sculpture, where the god, the departing god, that is depicted, by the way the Mesopotamians depicted their gods, tells a Mayan chieftain, points to him to the 10th planet, the Nibiru, and says, I assume, because there's the symbol for speaking, that's where I'm going back to, and I'll come back. So I'm not oblivious to the American legends, information, etc. But I deal with it perhaps more precisely than others.
You know how many people you have touched, how many lives you have touched with your work, and I would even go as far to say that this radio program, Coast to Coast AM, when Art Bell started it many years ago, had a strong basis in your work.
Yeah. Well, I was his guest many times, and he really pioneered a lot, and one has to give him credit for this program.
Nearly every culture, ancient culture, has talked about end-time prophecy, which, in some form or fashion, as a member of the human race, it's kind of scary when you think about it. I've got grandchildren and children. And I think about them, Zechariah. I think about what's going to happen and what's left for them. Does this bother you at all? Does this scare you at all, knowing what you know?
Well, I have great grandchildren, so of course I'm thinking of their future too. Well, I don't know whether scary is the word. It's we are definitely maybe we are fortunate. That we are living at this time of end of era, but as I point out in this book, The End of Days, and in my videos and talks, etc., and now I have the opportunity to say it on your program, George, is that when one wants to understand what was prophesied, what happened in the past, and what might happen in the coming future, is one has to remember that all the prophecies are making it very clear when, for example, there is a statement, I'm the first and I'm the last. The last thing shall be the first things, etc. We are talking about a cyclical. We are not talking about a linear progression.
Right.
That's why when there was year 2000 and people ask me what would happen in 2000, I said after 2000 will come 2001, because this is a linear calendar. It's a linear calendar. So we have to deal with the cyclical calendar. The zodiac is a cyclical calendar. And therefore, every ending is a beginning. Every ending is a beginning. So let's not lose hope.
Zechariah, do you know if the Sumerian tablets are still intact, or, were any of them ruined because of the war in Iraq, or are they still in a museum, safe and sound? Do you know?
Well, those that were taken out of Iraq, and we are talking now 150 years of archaeology, so there are tens of thousands of tablets, some fully intact, and some partially intact, and some in fragments, and some fully legible, and some not legible to some extent, and by the way, of the libraries that were found, for example, in the ruins of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, in the library of the king Ashurbanipal, some 30,000 tablets were discovered just in one library.
Oh my gosh!
So they were taken mostly out of Iraq, and they are in various museums, the British Museum, the Louvre in Berlin, and some in Philadelphia, and other museums, and many of them have been read and deciphered, and some of those deciphered were published, but most of them linger in basements of the museums because there are just not enough people who can sit with magnifying glasses and read those tablets.
In your entire life, because we're running out of time here, and I want to thank you for spending the hour with us. I know it's very late on the East Coast where you are.
George. It's my pleasure.
In your entire life and career, what has been for you the most remarkable thing that you've touched, that in terms of work? Was it the Earth Chronicles, the writing of the 12th Planet? What was it?
Well, to some extent, the most gratifying thing was my own sense of discovery. That here I'm looking at lines that, I'm not talking just about the tablets that most people cannot read, and I'm fortunate that I can read them, but even looking at the Bible, and most people get the Bible either through what they hear from Sunday preachers, or they read in translation. Every translation is an interpretation. Not many are fortunate, like I've been, to study the Old Testament in its original Hebrew. So there's this personal gratification as I watch the news and see that, for example, when I say that Nibiru was a planet thrust out from another solar system and got attracted into ours. So at that time, who would believe in what they now call extrasolar planets, of which some 300 have been discovered already?
You have given us a gift, Zechariah Sitchin, with all your work, including the latest, the Earth Chronicles Handbook. And thank you so much for being on Coast to Coast AM.
An extraordinary opening in space or time that connects travelers to distant realms. A good portal is a shortcut, a guide, a door into the unknown. If only they actually existed. It turns out that they do, sort of. And a NASA-funded researcher at the University of Iowa has figured out how to find them. We call them X-points, or electron diffusion regions, explains plasma physicist Jack Scudder of the University of Iowa. They're places where the magnetic field of Earth connects to the magnetic field of the Sun, creating an uninterrupted path leading from our own planet to the Sun's atmosphere 93 million miles away. Observations by NASA's Themis spacecraft and Europe's cluster probes suggest that these magnetic portals open and close.
when they went to the moon, they forgot to tell us about its true natural color. This is a film that challenges anyone to prove to us the moon is gray. It's not. The moon filmed in full color and using a backyard telescope and a $68 webcam. And then you get to look at the pictures. Colors galore. And what's really fun, Jose, is when you show the Apollo astronauts up there on the moon, and all around them is this gray and black terrain. And yet when you look in the faceplate of the spacesuit, I don't know which astronaut that is, back at the camera, you see color. You see colorful soil. You see color. Yeah, Buzz Aldrin. You see colors all over the place. And now, who took this film of the moon with color?
This was taken by NASA during the Clementine mission back in 1994.
Okay.
At least that's when they supposedly released the full color photography that exists. In my film Celestial, you'll find that I was trying to research and find this crater called Guyot, G-U-Y-O-T, which is above the crater that's featured in Celestial, the Lobachevsky crater, where there seems to be an object that was built within an 8-month period that's 10 miles wide and 6 miles high. Somebody built it between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17.
You have a starting time frame, an image, which it's not there, and then 8 months later it's there.
Yeah. So somebody built this 10-mile wide, 6-mile high structure on this crater called Lobachevsky. And Apollo 16, they photographed it. I mean, all of the Apollo missions had an interest on Lobachevsky crater for whatever reason. They've been filming that crater since Apollo 8. Okay, so they've been filming it and photographing it. And then Apollo 16, which was in April of 72, there was an excavation going on, and there's a photo that shows a thing I call the excavator. That seems to be a machine of some type, or maybe a living creature or something that's digging the hole.
Okay.
Or 8 months later, this huge structure appears. And you can see those in the Celestial
photos section. All right,
the first photo, the top photo, Apollo
Let's click
16.
on that right now. Celestial film reveals moon structures and colors. Photos. Look for that.
Yes.
And click on that, which I'm doing right now. I can get it.
You can see what appears to be a hole being dug, and there's it looks like a tower or a cross, white one. And then in the next photo, you don't see the tower, but you see what looks like a machine or a creature. I call it the excavator. That's excavating. And that's from Apollo 16 photography. And then on the Apollo 17 photography in December 72, this structure now appears. And it appears to have cables strewing out of the top, and it's 6 miles high, 10 miles wide.
Okay, let me go back. Let's go back to the first picture. People have got photos loaded up now. This is Celestial. Look for the Celestial photos and click on the text, and you'll load that page up. Apollo 16, April 1972. And if you look, you'll see there's an item clearly in the foreground, right dead center, right above the A in April. And you can scroll down to the next image, and there's a close-up of that. Wow.
It looks like Mothra. Remember that old sci-fi movie?
Oh, sure.
Or Rodon or Rodin, but Mothra. This looks like a worm of some kind or something, or a caterpillar or something.
Well,
weird.
It also looks like, the shape of it looks like almost a soda bottle laying on its side with the bottom blown out of it.
Yeah, but you can see a shadow underneath it where it's hovering.
I see that.
Covered.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing. We don't know what it is. Can't explain it. NASA's definitely not making any remarks about it, but it appears in one of the Apollo 16 photography taken at the same time in April of 1972.
I'm looking at it with a magnifying glass, and the bottom end of it, the left end, the top, has two what look like almost appendages. Although that could be something. Again, I also see it though as dark in there. It looks like something could have blown. I don't know what it is, but it's right next to
Don't know what it is either.
A crater or something that has been dug out. And
that's that portion. If you go back to the Apollo 16 photo, you can see this thing. It's almost a color gray, but you can see what appears to be a white cross and the hole that's being dug.
Uh-huh.
But that's the exact same position that on the Apollo 7.
Walking on the moon. Now, planting on the moon? In 2015, NASA will try to grow basil, sunflowers, turnips, and more in aluminum cylinders on the surface. Various sensors will monitor the plant's growth and send data to us Earthlings, offending every locavore everywhere.
I'm Aki Roberge, an astronomer at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. I've been studying a young nearby planetary system around the bright star Beta Pictoris. Located 63 light-years away and only about 20 million years old, the star is surrounded by a vast disk of gas, dust, and comet-like bodies that we view edgewise. We know of one planet in there too. It's a giant planet tracking along an orbit nearly as large as Saturn's. I'm part of a team studying Beta Pic's disk using the ALMA Observatory in Chile. We've found something odd. A belt of carbon monoxide gas centered about 3 times farther from the star than Neptune's distance from the Sun. The total amount of gas is about 1/6 the mass of all the water in Earth's oceans. What's interesting is that incoming ultraviolet light should break up the carbon monoxide molecules in little more than a century on average. This means that the carbon monoxide must be resupplied by the breakup of icy comets. To produce the amount of gas we detect, we're looking at the equivalent of the total destruction of a large comet every 5 minutes. From our data, we can tell that much of the carbon monoxide is in 1 or 2 massive clumps, which was very surprising. Because we're viewing the disk edge-on, we can't be sure if it's 1 or 2. Regardless, the comet supplying the gas must also be concentrated into clumps. How could this happen? If there is one clump, we think we're seeing the aftermath of a collision between two icy planets about the mass of Mars. Such a collision would have occurred about 500,000 years ago, releasing large quantities of gas and small comet-like fragments. The second, and we think more likely scenario, is that the carbon monoxide exists in two clumps and is continually replenished by collisions in huge comet swarms. We believe the comets are shepherded together by an as-yet undetected second planet, whose gravity confines the comets into a small region so they frequently collide. A planet with roughly Saturn's mass could do the job. Other observations hint that the brightest clump is moving in a way that makes the two-clump scenario more likely. Further observations will track it in better detail and help us confirm this dramatic picture.
It's a great honor tonight to introduce Zechariah Sitchin again this hour, an eminent Orientalist, biblical scholar. Zechariah Sitchin, distinguished by his ability to read ancient Sumerian clay tablets and other ancient texts. Through such texts, religious documents, and archaeological findings, he has reconstructed epic events that support the existence of extraterrestrial gods who once set nation against nation and man against man. Zechariah Sitchin is a graduate of the University of London, worked as a journalist and editor in Israel for many years, living now and writing in New York, and he is our proud guest tonight on Coast to Coast. Zechariah, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine, George.
Good to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Tell me how this all started for you, Zechariah, how you started researching the Sumerian tablets.
Well, it's a long story, and I've told it already many times, and it all goes back to when I was a schoolboy, fortunate to study the Bible, the Old Testament in its original Hebrew language, and I asked improper questions of the teacher and got reprimanded, and that's how it started.
As you began to unravel the mysteries of the tablets, and you are a scholar and an expert, and I think that